For over a century, a single sentence Abraham Lincoln said to his own law partner was treated as either a confession or a slur, and nobody could prove which. That single sentence sat at the center of one of American history's longest-running, most respectfully argued genealogical disputes, debated across generations of biographers who each believed, in turn, that they had finally found the definitive answer, only for the next generation to reopen the question all over again. In 2015, a small team of genealogists finally ran the DNA that should have settled it once and for all. What they found did resolve the mystery, and it is genuinely one of the more satisfying detective stories in American genealogy. It is not, however, quite the story most of the videos currently circulating about it are telling you. By the end of this, you are going to know exactly what that DNA actually proved, what it did not, and why the real story here needed no exaggeration at all to be worth your time. Picture Nancy Hanks. Lincoln, the way the historical record actually preserves her, because almost nothing about her comes down to us through anything as solid as a photograph or a signed document. She was born sometime around 1784, most likely in Virginia, and died in October of 1818 in a one-room cabin in southern Indiana, killed by what settlers of the era called milk sickness, a mysterious and often fatal illness later traced to white snakeroot poison passed through the milk of cows that had grazed on the plant, an illness that killed thousands of settlers across the Ohio Valley before anyone understood its actual cause. No portrait of her survives from life, no letter in her own hand, nothing but the recollections other people carried of her decades after she was gone, filtered through grief, through the mythologizing that inevitably attaches itself to the mother of a martyred president, and through the simple, ordinary erosion of memory across generations. The same kind of erosion that makes so much of early American frontier history frustratingly thin, no matter how carefully later historians go looking for it. Everything historians know about her character, her appearance, her temperament comes secondhand, gathered years later from neighbors and relatives trying to reconstruct a woman most of them had known only briefly or as children themselves. Her son Abraham was 9 years old when she died. He grew up to become the 16th President of the United States, the man who held the country together through its bloodiest war and signed the document that began the legal end of slavery in America. And by the time he reached that office, his mother had been dead for decades, remembered mostly through the recollections of neighbors, relatives, and one particular man who knew Lincoln better than almost anyone else alive. Lincoln himself, later in life, is reported to have spoken of his mother with real tenderness, crediting her, in various recollections, with whatever intellectual curiosity and ambition eventually carried him out of frontier poverty and into the White House. That reverence makes the ancestry question more than a dry genealogical puzzle. It sits at the emotional center of how one of America's most mythologized figures understood his own origins. That man was William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner for 16 years, right up until the night Lincoln left Springfield for Washington in 1861. After the assassination, Herndon spent years collecting interviews, letters, and personal recollections from everyone who had known Lincoln, determined to build the most honest and complete portrait of the man that had ever existed, resisting the instinct so many others gave into, which was to sand Lincoln down into a flawless marble saint the moment he became a martyr. Herndon's research produced one claim that has generated controversy for a century and a half. He reported that Lincoln told him, privately, that his mother had been illegitimate. Here's the detail that should already feel like something does not fully add up, the seed worth holding on to as we go. Lincoln, according to other accounts, also said his mother was born in Virginia and had come to Kentucky with relatives rather than with her own parents. On the surface, those two statements, illegitimate and raised by relatives, might seem to sit comfortably together. Look closer at the actual families involved in Nancy's upbringing, and they start to pull in opposite directions instead. If Nancy truly was the illegitimate daughter of Lucy Hanks, born a Hanks herself, why would she have grown up surrounded by an entirely different family, the Berrys and the Shipleys, rather than the Hanks family in a different county altogether? That question sat unresolved for well over 100 years, debated by serious historians using nothing but paper records, family letters, and educated guesswork, because the one kind of evidence that could actually settle it, biological evidence, simply did not exist yet as a tool historians could use. It is worth pausing on just how long that gap actually lasted. Genetic genealogy as a reliable, accessible research tool is barely a few decades old, which means the vast majority of the scholars who ever engaged seriously with this specific debate spent their entire careers working without any realistic hope of the kind of definitive answer later researchers would eventually obtain. Here is the story as it was understood and taught for most of the 20th century. And it deserves real credit because generations of careful historians built it from exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous archival work history is supposed to be built on. Most historians who studied Lincoln's ancestry closely came to agree on the basic shape of Nancy Hanks's origin. She was almost certainly the illegitimate daughter of a young woman named Lucy Hanks, who went on to have a second illegitimate daughter, Sarah, before eventually marrying a man named Henry Sparrow and having 8 more children within that marriage. That much achieved something close to consensus, a rare enough outcome in a field where sources this old and this fragmentary usually leave far more room for disagreement. The genuinely contested question sat one generation further back. Who were Lucy Hanks's own parents? 2 competing answers emerged, each backed by respected historians willing to put their names and reputations behind them in published biographies that circulated widely enough to shape how generations of readers understood Lincoln's origins. One tradition, associated with biographers including William Barton, held that Lucy Hanks was the daughter of Joseph Hanks and his wife Anne, often recorded as Nancy Lee, placing Lucy squarely inside the Hanks family by birth. A second tradition, developed later and championed by the historian Lewis Warren, argued something more complicated, that Lucy Hanks had actually been born a Shipley, one of several Shipley sisters, and had been briefly married to a man named James Hanks, himself supposedly a son of Joseph and Anne Lee Hanks, before that marriage ended and she later married Henry Sparrow. Under Warren's version, Lucy would have been a Hanks by marriage rather than by birth, and Nancy's later connection to the Shipley and Berry families in Washington County, Kentucky, would make far more genealogical sense, since she would have been growing up among her mother's actual blood relatives, rather than a family with no clear biological tie to her at all. Both versions of this story were argued seriously by real historians, using the same underlying evidence: land records, church registers, marriage bonds, and the recollections other relatives had passed down across generations. Neither side was working from fantasy or wishful thinking. Both were doing exactly what responsible historical research looks like when the paper trail itself is incomplete, thin, and occasionally contradictory, which frontier-era Kentucky and Virginia records from the 1780s very often are. Vital records from this period and region were inconsistently kept, frequently lost to courthouse fires, and rarely concerned with capturing the kind of precise detail a modern genealogist would want. Given those limitations, it is entirely reasonable that 2 careful, well-credentialed historians could examine largely the same fragmentary evidence and walk away with genuinely different, defensible conclusions. For most of the 20th century, that is exactly where the debate remained. Unresolved, respectfully contested, and seemingly permanent, because the only kind of evidence that could definitively break the tie, something that did not depend on which scrap of paper had survived 2 centuries of fires and floods, simply did not exist yet. It is worth appreciating just how much careful, honest scholarship actually went into keeping this debate alive, rather than letting it collapse into guesswork. Both Barton and Warren were serious, published biographers, not amateur enthusiasts chasing a rumor. Each cross-referenced court records, church registries, and family correspondence spanning multiple states and multiple generations, building genealogical arguments detailed enough to fill entire chapters of published biography. That 2 such careful researchers, working from substantially overlapping source material, could arrive at genuinely incompatible conclusions says less about either historian's competence and more about the fundamental limits of what paper alone can prove. Once enough generations and enough lost records separate the researcher from the event in question. This is exactly the kind of honest, irreducible uncertainty that legitimate historical scholarship is supposed to acknowledge rather than paper over, and for most of a century, acknowledging it honestly was the most responsible thing either side of the debate could do. Here's where it starts to get stranger, not because anyone found a forged document or a hidden conspiracy, but because the closer historians looked at Lincoln's own private statements about his mother, the less neatly they lined up with either version of the family tree they were debating. Now look closer at Herndon's own account, because it is not quite as simple as a single dropped confession. Herndon did not merely report Lincoln calling his mother illegitimate in passing. He built an entire narrative around it, describing Lincoln as having spoken about his mother's parentage with real emotional weight, treating the subject as something private and painful rather than as a piece of casual family trivia. That emotional framing matters, because debate that had run for generations, once researchers finally sat with the completed data in front of them, cross-checking it against everything the paper record had already suggested before allowing themselves to treat it as conclusive. Picture the actual moment researchers confirmed what those 2 matching results meant when placed side by side. Not a hidden name materializing on a screen, a comparison table, a shared set of mutations on one side, a completely different haplogroup on the other, the kind of result that does not require dramatic interpretation because the numbers simply do not overlap. The Hanks-descended participants belong to a specific rare haplogroup, X1c, sharing not only that broad classification, but a precise cluster of additional shared mutations beyond it. The Shipley-descended participants belong to haplogroup H entirely, one of the most common maternal lineages in Europe, sharing no meaningful connection to the X1c group at all. two family trees, argued over by historians for 150 years, finally reduced to a simple, unambiguous genetic fact. They were not the same family. Here is the plain language version of what that actually proved, translated fully out of genetic terminology. Lucy Hanks, Nancy's mother, really was born a Hanks, matching the older Barton theory rather than Warren's Shipley theory. The rarity of the matching haplogroup made the result unusually confident as genealogical evidence goes, because a common, widely shared haplogroup could plausibly produce an accidental match between two unrelated families, while a genuinely rare one, sharing additional specific mutations, is a far stronger signal of real, shared descent. A century and a half of competing historical narratives, built entirely from paper and educated inference, was settled by a genetic signature so uncommon it left very little room for coincidence. Sit with that for a second, because it is worth being precise about exactly what this did and did not resolve. It confirmed which family Lucy Hanks was born into. It did not, and could not, identify Nancy Hanks's father, whose identity remains genuinely unknown to this day, a real, unresolved gap in the record rather than a detail anyone is concealing. And it did not, on its own, definitively explain why Nancy grew up among the Berry and Shipley families rather than the Hanks family. The very question that first made Lincoln's own vague statement about relatives feel like a loose thread worth pulling on in the first place. The DNA closed one specific century-old argument. It did not close every question surrounding Nancy Hanks Lincoln's early life. Think about what it actually took to reach a result this clean after a century and a half of argument. Two rival historians, each working with genuine rigor from incomplete paper records, had reached opposite conclusions and defended them for decades, each conclusion internally consistent enough that neither side could be dismissed as sloppy or careless. What finally broke the tie was not a new document surfacing in some forgotten archive, the kind of dramatic discovery these stories usually promise. It was a molecule, passed quietly and almost accidentally down through unbroken chains of motherhood for 2 centuries, waiting the entire time inside the cells of people who likely had no idea they were carrying the answer to a debate historians had been having about their own distant relative. What it means for how the whole story should actually be told is worth spelling out honestly, because this is exactly the point where a viral video's confident framing tends to outrun what the real findings actually support. Lincoln's own private discomfort in discussing it likely reflects less the frontier reality of his mother's childhood and more the far more image-conscious political culture surrounding him decades later in Washington, where a president's family history was expected to read as spotless. That gap between how Nancy's own community likely viewed her origins and how a later, more image-conscious political era would have viewed the same facts is itself worth sitting with. Frontier Kentucky in the 1780s was sparsely settled, socially fluid, and often far more concerned with a family's practical reputation for honesty and hard work than with the precise legal circumstances of any individual birth. By the time Lincoln himself was a national figure decades later, American political culture had shifted considerably toward exactly the kind of respectability politics that would have made even a relatively unremarkable frontier illegitimacy feel, to Lincoln personally, like something worth protecting rather than something to mention casually. That reframing raises real, still open questions worth sitting with rather than resolving artificially. If Nancy's illegitimacy carried relatively little stigma within her own community and era, why did Lincoln himself apparently treat the subject with such evident privacy and emotional weight when speaking to Herndon? Why, precisely, did Nancy end up raised among the Berry and Shipley households rather than her confirmed biological Hanks relatives? A specific arrangement the 2015 DNA results did not directly explain even after settling the larger parentage question. And what, if anything, can ever be determined about the identity of Nancy's father? A gap in the record that no mitochondrial test, however rare or precise the matching haplogroup, is capable of filling, since mtDNA, by its very nature, traces only the maternal line and says nothing at all about paternity. There is a further question worth naming even though this investigation cannot answer it. Whether any future genealogical technique, perhaps drawing on broader autosomal DNA testing across a wider set of descendants, rather than the maternal-line only approach mitochondrial testing allows, could eventually shed light on Nancy's paternity in a way that 2015 study structurally could not. That kind of investigation would face its own steep obstacles, given how few documented descendants exist along any relevant line and how much additional paper genealogy would need to be independently verified first. But it remains a genuinely open avenue, rather than a permanently closed door. To be fully honest about where the more dramatic retellings of this story tend to overreach, the specific framing found across many recent videos, describing this as a shocking, disturbing secret Lincoln begged someone to take to the grave, or emphasizing the rare haplogroup as tracing to a part of the world nobody predicted, in tones suggesting some scandalous hidden identity, stretches considerably beyond what the actual 2015 findings themselves establish. The haplogroup X1c is genuinely rare and genuinely associated with a geographic pattern concentrated in North Africa, East Africa, and the Near East, far more than with the general European ancestry most Appalachian frontier families carry. And that is a real, legitimately interesting detail worth noting on its own terms. It reflects ancient population history stretching back many thousands of years, not any specific, identifiable recent ancestor from that region. And presenting it as some kind of scandalous secret misrepresents what population geneticists actually mean when they describe haplogroup distribution. The real finding is fascinating precisely because it is unusual and ancient, not because it is disturbing. There's a bigger pattern worth sitting with before we close this out, one that applies well beyond one presidential family tree. Real historical mysteries, patiently investigated and genuinely resolved through careful, verifiable science, do not actually need manufactured shock value to hold an audience's attention. A century and a half of respected historians disagreeing, a genuinely elegant piece of genetic detective work finally settling the argument, and one real, still unanswered question, who Nancy's father actually was, sitting honestly unresolved at the end of it. That is already a complete, satisfying, true story. Wrapping it in words like disturbing and terrifying does not make the underlying history more real. It just makes it easier to mistake for something it was never actually claiming to be. That distinction matters for more than just this one video. The genuine craft in a story like this lies in trusting the audience to find real, patient, well-documented history compelling on its own terms, rather than assuming every historical finding needs a layer of manufactured scandal bolted on top of it before anyone will care. The Lincoln family genuinely did carry a real, private, emotionally significant secret for generations. It just was not the kind of secret that needed exaggeration to matter. Run it back one more time. 150 years of genuine, scholarly disagreement over whether Lucy Hanks was born a Hanks or a Shipley. William Herndon's real, documented account of Lincoln privately describing his mother as illegitimate. A 2015 mitochondrial DNA study, run through a real genetic genealogy project, finally confirming the Hanks side of that century-old argument through a rare, specific, shared haplogroup. And one question the DNA never touched at all, the identity of Nancy's father, still sitting exactly where it always has, unresolved. So here is what I want to know from you. Knowing that the real mystery here was solved by patient genealogy rather than any hidden scandal, does that make this story more interesting to you or less? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this pulled you in, wait until you see what DNA testing revealed about another founding-era American family whose paper trail told an entirely different story than their genes did. That one's next. Go watch it. And there's a date already locked into that decade-long plan, one that has nothing to do with luck and everything to do with math. Rubin's very first full annual data release, DR1, the enormous public catalog built from an entire uninterrupted year of survey observations covering billions of stars, galaxies, and solar system objects, is targeted for release by the end of June 2028, almost exactly 1 year after the 12 months of raw data behind it finish being collected. That is not a guess. It is a scheduled endpoint on an engineering timeline that has already survived a pandemic, a vacuum leak, and years of technical delay to get this far. Somewhere in that eventual release, cross-referenced against a full year of nightly scans instead of 10 accidental hours, will be the answer to how many more objects like 2025 MN45 are quietly spinning out there, waiting to be counted. Now, the part that doesn't wrap up neatly, because the actual scientific literature doesn't wrap it up neatly either, nobody has definitively confirmed why 2025 MN45 exists in the form it does. The leading explanation, that it's a solid fragment blasted off the dense, differentiated interior of a much larger parent body during a violent collision billions of years ago, fits the data, but it remains, in the researchers' own framing, the most likely scenario rather than a proven one. A competing possibility researchers have not ruled out is that some smaller fraction of asteroids simply formed as coherent, solid bodies from the start, never passing through a rubble pile stage at all, meaning objects like this one could be far more common and far less exotic